Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be looking at a really interesting situation in Morocco.
Okay.
So picture this, right? A country's dealing with like a really bad drought.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, that leads to economic problems.
Yeah.
And right in the middle of all of that, they've got this huge holiday coming up,
Mm.
Eid al-Adha,
Right.
which like centers around sacrifice and helping people and all of that. And then you've got the King of Morocco.
Yeah.
He basically says, you know what, I'm going to break with tradition this year.
Wow.
And I'm going to forego the sacrifice myself, or actually I'm going to do it on behalf of like all Moroccans.
That's a pretty big move.
Huge.
Yeah.
So we want to kind of unpack like what led up to that decision and what it says about leadership in times of crisis.
Yeah, you've really hit on, I think, some of the most fascinating parts of this whole thing. You've got climate and then economics and religion,
Right.
and then you throw leadership right on top of that.
Exactly.
It's a lot happening at once.
Yeah. So to like really get this,
Mm-hmm.
we need to kind of understand just how bad things were in Morocco in 2025.
Right.
So can you kind of like set the scene a little bit? Like what was everyday life actually like for people who are living through this drought?
Yeah. So, I mean, imagine, Morocco is really known for agriculture,
Yeah.
and that's a huge part of their economy.
Right.
But in 2025, they were just gripped by this horrible drought. I mean, some areas hadn't seen that little rain in decades,
Oh, wow.
and it was devastating.
Mhm.
Like crops are dying, livestock is dying.
So it's like a double whammy.
Yeah,
Then, families are already struggling to like just get food on the table.
yeah,
But then on top of that, like basic stuff like meat, the price is just going through the roof.
exactly. And so for a lot of families, being able to afford to do the traditional sacrifice for Eid al-Adha
Right.
was just completely out of reach.
Yeah. And so you've got this like backdrop of all this hardship.
Right.
And then this major holiday, Eid al-Adha, comes into play.
Yeah.
And you mentioned it revolves around this idea of sacrifice. So
Mhm.
can you kind of explain like what that tradition means for Moroccans, but also Muslims, like globally?
Oh, yeah. So Eid al-Adha, it's one of the most important holidays in the Islamic calendar.
Okay.
And it's celebrated by, Muslims all over the world.
Got it.
And it's basically commemorating the Prophet Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son
Wow.
as like an act of obedience to God.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so during this holiday, families will traditionally sacrifice an animal.
Right.
Usually it's like a sheep or a goat.
Okay.
And it symbolizes submission to God, but it's also really tied to charity and sharing.
Oh, okay.
So they'll divide the meat from the sacrifice into three parts. One part's for the family, one part's for friends and neighbors,
Yeah.
and then one part is specifically for the poor and needy.
So it's not just like a symbolic thing. It's really like built into the whole, like social fabric of the holiday.
Totally.
And it's like creating this sense of community.
Thanks
And
for sharing. Yeah, and so you can imagine how difficult it is for people who are already struggling to make ends meet.
right.
It's like, are they gonna uphold this tradition that's so important,
Right.
even if it means, going into debt, or are they gonna break with tradition?
Yeah.
And then maybe face disapproval from like their community or even religiously.
That's such a hard place to be.
Yeah, it really was like an impossible choice for a lot of people.
And I mean, that's where King Mohammed VI comes in, right?
Exactly.
With this decision to basically not do the sacrifice himself,
Right.
but do it on behalf of everyone in Morocco.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty big move, like I said.
It really is, especially when you think about, his position, not just as the head of state,
Right.
but also as the commander of the believers.
Right, which carries like a ton of religious weight.
Huge religious weight.
Yeah. So, I mean, I imagine that, a lot of people saw this as like a really compassionate response to this crisis.
Yes.
But were there also people who weren't so happy with it?
Oh, absolutely. It was a bold move, and it was definitely unprecedented.
Right.
And for some people, breaking with tradition like that, no matter what the reason,
Right.
can be a little unsettling.
Yeah, I could see
Like
that.
maybe it sets a bad precedent
Mm-hmm.
for future leaders.
Yeah.
What if they start exploiting religious tradition
Right, right.
for their own political gain?
Yeah, so it's like even when you have something that seems like it's coming from a good place,
Mm-hmm.
there are still these other layers of complexity.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And like you said, unintended consequences.
Yeah. And that's what makes this so interesting to like really dig into, because
Right.
it's not just charity.
Yeah.
It's about leadership. It's about tradition. It's about pragmatism. And then religion and government are all mixed up in it, too.
So many different facets to
Yeah.
this.
Definitely.
So let's kind of focus in on the king himself for a minute.
Okay.
What was his reasoning for making this decision?
Mm-hmm.
Was it purely about the economics, like to help people financially? Or was there something more going on?
Right. I mean, easing the financial burden was definitely a big part of it.
Yeah.
But his message was a lot deeper than that.
Okay.
Like in his public address about this, he really emphasized that the true spirit of Eid al-Adha is more about compassion and prayer and helping those in need,
Got it.
not just the sacrifice itself.
So he was trying to get people to think about it less like the outward ritual
Yeah.
and more about the meaning behind it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like focus on the essence of the holiday.
Okay.
Yeah. And he really encouraged Moroccans to find like different ways to celebrate
Okay.
that, actually reflected those values.
Right.
So like, giving to charity, doing acts of service in their community,
Okay.
really focusing on prayer and spiritual reflection.
Yeah.
And he even gave specific examples, like, donating to food banks or helping out families who are really struggling.
So he was trying to kind of like reframe the whole idea of the holiday.
Yeah.
Move it away from something that could be, potentially divisive.
Right.
To something that everyone could, get behind.
Mm-hmm.
This message of sharing and, collective responsibility.
Exactly.
And did it work? I mean, did people actually respond to that?
Yeah, it's really interesting because there were a lot of reports of people actually doing just that.
Why?
Like people were organizing community initiatives, donating to charities,
Oh, wow.
sharing meals with their neighbors, like all the things that the king had talked about.
So it sounds like his decision, even though it was, unconventional,
Yeah.
might have actually brought people together even more.
It really might have,
Like strengthened that feeling of unity and solidarity.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, did this have any impact outside of Morocco?
Mm-hmm.
Did other, Muslim majority countries or religious leaders have anything to say about it?
Yeah, it definitely started conversations
Okay.
in Muslim communities all over the world.
Interesting.
Some religious scholars and leaders really praised the king for his compassion and saw it as, maybe a model for how to deal with similar challenges.
Yeah.
But of course, there are also people who were concerned
Right.
about, moving away from these long-held traditions.
Right, of course.
They were worried about setting a precedent that could be misinterpreted or even misused.
So it became this much bigger conversation
Yeah.
about, how religious traditions can evolve.
Exactly.
Especially with all the challenges the world is facing today.
Yeah, like climate change and economic disparities and all the social unrest.
Yeah.
It's definitely relevant to all of that.
So we've talked about, the situation in Morocco, the king's decision, his reasoning behind it, and even how it affected people globally.
Right.
But I think now it's time to look at what this tells us about leadership,
Okay.
especially during tough times.
Yeah.
What kind of leader does it take to make a decision like this?
What do you think?
A decision that's so bold and so different from what's been done before.
Well, I think King Mohammed VI's decision really shows us a few important qualities
Okay.
of a good leader.
Okay.
Like, first of all, it shows he really understands the needs and the challenges that his people are facing.
Right. He's not just making these decisions out of touch with what's going on.
Exactly. He was very aware of how much people were struggling
Yeah.
because of the drought and the economy.
So empathy is a really crucial part of that.
Definitely. But empathy isn't enough on its own.
Okay.
You need courage, too.
Right.
And you have to be willing to challenge how things have always been done, even if it means people are going to criticize you.
Of course.
He understood that sometimes being a leader means making tough choices.
Right.
Even if those choices, break with tradition or go against what people expect.
So it's about putting the well-being of the people
Exactly.
out of, just sticking to customs,
Yes.
especially when those customs are actually hurting people.
Exactly. And there's another piece here, too. It's not enough to just make the decisions.
Yeah.
You have to be able to explain them in a way that people understand, and that makes sense to them.
Yeah.
And I think the king did a good job of that.
Okay.
He didn't just, issue a decree.
Right.
He explained his reasoning.
Yeah.
And he did it with compassion.
Right.
He appealed to that sense of shared responsibility
Right.
that Moroccans have.
So it wasn't just hey, I'm in charge and this is what we're doing.
Exactly.
It was I understand your struggles and this is why I'm doing this.
Exactly. And it wasn't even like he was rejecting tradition. It was more like he was actually reaffirming the true values that Eid al-Adha is all about.
So his actions and his words were totally aligned
Yeah.
to create this really powerful message.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about conveying information.
Right.
It was about inspiring people to act differently,
Yeah.
to really find new ways to express the spirit of Eid.
So he was a leader in every sense of the word.
Exactly. And this brings us to another really important aspect of leadership.
Okay.
Adaptability.
Right.
King Mohammed VI showed that he can adapt to changing situations.
Right.
And he realized that just clinging to traditions during a crisis like this wouldn't really help anyone.
Right. He was willing to bend a little.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Real leadership isn't about being stuck in the past.
Right.
It's about evolving and finding new ways to do things.
So he basically took this crisis
Yeah.
and used it as a chance for growth.
Exactly.
Not just for himself,
No.
but for the whole country.
You got it. And that's a huge lesson we can all learn from this.
Okay.
Leadership is about serving the people you lead.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that means breaking with tradition,
Yeah.
challenging what people think,
Right.
and finding a new way forward.
So we've really been unpacking this whole situation in Morocco.
Yeah.
The drought, the economic crisis,
Right.
and then the king's decision to break with centuries of tradition during Eid al-Adha.
It's been fascinating.
And you've really helped explain, like the context and the reasons behind it all.
Mm-hmm.
But I kind of want to zoom out a bit now
Okay.
and think about the bigger picture here.
Yeah.
Like, what are the implications of all of this?
Mm-hmm.
Why should our listener, who might be on the other side of the world, even care about what happened way over in Morocco?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Because at first it might seem like, just a local thing.
Right.
But I think it actually says a lot about leadership,
Okay.
about tradition, and how we deal with crises.
Got it.
And those are things that are important no matter where you live.
Okay. I'm listening. Break it down for us.
Okay, so think about it this way.
Yeah.
Every society has its own traditions, right? Customs and rituals
Yeah.
that have been passed down for generations.
Right.
And they often serve a purpose.
Right.
Like they give us a sense of identity, community,
Right.
continuity. But what happens when those traditions don't really fit with the modern world anymore?
Right.
Or when following them actually causes more harm than good?
That's exactly what the king was dealing with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He had to balance respect for tradition with the need to adapt to this crisis.
And I mean, his decision really shows us that traditions aren't set in stone.
Right.
They can change, and maybe they should change.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They need to evolve to meet the needs of society.
So it's not about just clinging to the past.
Yeah.
It's about reinterpreting and adapting them to fit with the present.
Right. And that takes a certain way of thinking.
Okay.
You have to be willing to question the status quo and be brave enough to make hard choices.
Yeah.
Even when it means challenging what people have always believed.
So basically you're saying traditions should serve us, not the other way around.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important takeaway for everyone listening.
Yeah.
Like, think about your own life, your own community, your own culture.
Go.
Are there any traditions that seem outdated or burdensome?
Right.
Or maybe just don't line up with your values anymore?
Yeah.
Are there ways to adapt them,
Okay.
to breathe new life into them while still honoring what they stand for?
Wow. That's a really good question. Gonna have to think about that.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
And that's what's so great about this story. It makes us all stop and think.
Yeah.
And remember that tradition isn't about blindly following the past.
Right.
It's about finding ways to honor our heritage
Okay.
while also adapting to the challenges of today.
So what about leadership then?
Mm-hmm.
Not just in Morocco,
Yeah.
but globally.
Right.
Does this whole thing offer any lessons for other leaders?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Especially those dealing with crises. His actions are like a blueprint for what I would call adaptive leadership.
Adaptive leadership. Okay.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, it's all about empathy,
Mm.
flexibility, willingness to challenge the status quo,
Got it.
and most importantly, a commitment to putting people's needs first.
That sounds like exactly the kind of leadership we need right now.
Yeah.
With everything going on in the world. Like you
Right.
said, climate change, economic inequality,
No.
social unrest.
All of it.
We need leaders who can think critically,
Yeah.
adapt to change,
Right.
and put people first.
And who are willing to find new solutions
Yeah.
instead of clinging to old ways of thinking.
So even though this all happened in Morocco,
Yeah.
it really highlights this universal need for good leadership.
Exactly.
Leadership that can get us through tough times and help us build a better future.
You said it perfectly.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation.
It's been a pleasure.
You've given our listeners so much to think about.
I hope so.
Any final words of wisdom before we wrap things up?
Just keep the conversation going.
Okay.
Think about the traditions in your own life.
Yeah.
Question your assumptions about leadership.
And don't be afraid of change.
That's great advice.
Thank you.
And on that note, that's going to do it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.